Picture a block on the west side of Buffalo, New York, on a cold morning around the turn of the century, 1900 or a little after. A crew of men is pulling down a house, not an ordinary house. A 5-story tower of dark stone and heavy wood is coming apart under their hammers, the grandest private residence ever built in the state outside New York City, and it has stood empty for about 10 years. I have gone back to this scene more often than I can easily explain because of what the house was and because of who was not there to watch it fall. The man who built it was named William George Fargo. He had made his fortune moving other people's money across a country that had no dependable way to move it, and the company he built to do that is still here. It is one of the largest financial companies on Earth. You have almost certainly carried its name in your own wallet. He has been gone from it, and from the world, for a very long time. Fargo ran American Express for more than 30 years, and there is no Fargo anywhere at the company today. The costliest private house in the state outside Manhattan was torn down about 30 years after it was finished, while it was still one of the grandest in the country. One co-founder had 8 children, and 5 of them died in childhood, and the only 2 who outlived him were daughters, so that the family name, in his own line, ended with him. Those same 2 men founded a second company 2 years later, and only the second one kept their names into the present century. The business the company was born to do, carrying gold and cash across the country by armed messenger, was seized by the federal government in 1918 and never given back. For 115 years, the company was not, in law, a corporation at all. The traveler's check was invented because the president of the company, Fargo, could not get a single bank in Europe to cash his own letter of credit. A messenger boy, hired in 1866, invented both the money order and the traveler's check, and almost no one alive has heard his name. And today, the company reports $72 billion a year, and its largest single owner is a man in Omaha who is descended from none of the people who built it. Every one of those things is documented. None of them is the reason the house came down. This is the story of the family that built American Express, one of the most durable companies in the history of American money. It is also the story of how the thing they built outlived them so completely that the man who ran it for more than 30 years left no heir at the company, no name on the brand, and a palace that was rubble within a generation, while the machine he ran went on issuing money to the world for another 100 years without him. I want to start on that west side block, with the wreckers and the empty tower, because to understand how a family could build something this permanent and leave so little of themselves inside it, you have to begin where those 2 facts touch. Before we go on, one quiet thing. Subscribing helps build a small community around work like this and rewards the hours that go into it. Chapter 1. The house they pulled down. Start with the house, because the house is the clearest thing the family ever said about itself, and because it is gone. William Fargo bought the land in 1868, 5.5 acres on the west side of Buffalo, 2 full city blocks bounded by streets that would later carry his name. He began building that year and finished in 1872. The result was a French Second Empire mansion in dark stone, topped by a mansard tower 5 stories high, and by the standards of Buffalo, or of almost anywhere in the country outside New York City, there was nothing like it. It cost $600,000 to build, and another $100,000 to furnish, in the money of the 1870s, when a comfortable house could be had for a few thousand. The details are the kind that get repeated because they are hard to believe. The wood inside came from every state then in the Union. There were reports of gold doorknobs. There was a barber shop inside the house. There was an elevator, the first in any private home in the city. at a time when most Americans had never ridden in one anywhere. Presidents came to the door. Ulysses Grant is said to have visited, and Grover Cleveland, and Mark Twain. For a stretch of years, it was one of the addresses in America, the physical proof that a farmer's son from central New York who left school at 13 had climbed as far as a man could climb. And then, within about 30 years, it was gone. Fargo died in 1881, less than a decade after the house was finished. His widow, Anna, stayed on in it until her own death in 1890. After that, the house sat. The surviving daughters had lives and homes elsewhere and no wish to keep up a mansion the size of a small hotel. So it stood empty, block long and dark, through the 1890s, and around 1900 or 1901, the wreckers came and took it down. The land was cut into ordinary residential lots and sold, and streets were run through where the ballrooms had been. A newel post from the grand staircase is said to survive in a Buffalo museum, a single carved fragment of a house that once filled 2 city blocks. The rest is pavement and front lawns. There is a reason the daughters could not simply hold it, and it is the quiet engine of this whole story. So it is worth naming early, even though we will come back to it. William Fargo had 8 children. 5 of them died in childhood, and of the ones who lived, only 2, both daughters, outlived their parents. There was no son to carry the Fargo name into the house and keep it lit. By the time the mansion stood empty, the family that might have kept a home of that size had thinned to 2 daughters who had long since made their lives under other names, in other cities. The house did not fall because the money ran out. The money did not run out. It fell because there was almost no one left with a reason to keep it standing. I find it hard to walk past that fact quickly. A house that cost the equivalent of a fortune, that held wood from every state, and an elevator no neighbor could match, stood for roughly 1 human generation and then was pulled apart while it was still one of the finest in the country. Buildings that grand usually become museums or embassies or landmarks. This one became a memory and a set of building lots. Fargo Avenue still runs through the west side of Buffalo, past ordinary houses, and the largest surviving piece of the grandest home in the state outside Manhattan is, today, that street sign. That is the puzzle I want to sit inside for the next hour, because the house is not really the strange part. The strange part is that the same decade that erased the house also, in a quieter way, erased the family, while the company they built to pay for all of it went on, and is going still. To understand how that happened, you have to go back another 20 years and 300 miles to a moment when there was no company at all. Only 3 small firms, 3 self-made men, and a country that could not reliably get its own money from one city to the next. Chapter 2. The Merger. On the 18th of March, 1850, in Buffalo, 3 rival express firms agreed to stop competing and become one. The firms were small, and their names are worth saying once because they are the raw material of everything that came after. There was Wells and Company, run by Henry Wells. There was Livingston Fargo and Company, in which William Fargo was a partner. And there was Butterfield, Wasson and Company, run by John Butterfield. Together they formed a single concern and called it the American Express Company, capitalized at $150,000. They organized it not as a corporation, but as a joint stock association, a looser and older legal form in which shares could be traded like a company's, but the members could be held personally responsible like partners. It is an odd, archaic structure, and the company would keep it, remarkably, for 115 years, not incorporating until 1965. For now, the point is only this: 3 small firms became one under a national name, in a legal form built more for a partnership of trusting men than for a modern corporation. Consider the three men who signed on, because none of them was born to anything. Henry Wells was a former tanner and a schoolteacher for stammerers who had grown up in Western New York with a bad stutter of his own. He was self-taught, physically enormous and relentless, and he had been in the express business since the early 1840s, carrying letters and parcels faster than the mail. By the standards of respectable society, he was a rough, striving man, and he had built one of the first express routes into the American West. William George Fargo was a farmer's son from Pompey, New York, one of a large family, who had left school at 13 to carry the mail on foot and by wagon. He had been a freight agent and a messenger, and had worked his way up through the same express trade as Wells. He was practical, tireless, and good with men and money, the kind of operator who rose not by brilliance, but by never once dropping what he was carrying. Where Wells was the visionary of the early express trade, Fargo was its engine, the man who made the routes actually run. John Butterfield was a stagecoach man from Berne, New York, who had started as a coach driver and built a transport empire across the state. He would later run the great overland mail route to California, the one that carried his name across the maps of the West. Three men, then, with almost no formal schooling among them, who between them controlled the fastest way to move a valuable object across the eastern United States. And when they merged, the name they agreed on told you something they may not have meant to say. They did not call it Wells and Fargo. They did not call it Butterfields. They called it American Express, a name with a country in it and a promise in it, and not one of their own names anywhere inside it. I do not want to make too much of a name chosen in a Buffalo office in 1850, but it is the first thread of the whole story, and it is worth pulling once. From the very beginning, the men who built this company put the nation's name on it and left their own off. They built something designed to outlast the people who signed the papers. It did exactly that, and the men who did it seem, in retrospect, to have half understood the bargain they were making. In its first years, the young company divided the country by agreement with its chief rival, Adams and Company, taking the North and the West for itself and leaving the South and the East to Adams. And it pushed its routes out along the new railroads as fast as the rails were laid. It opened in Chicago in 1854. For a few years the arrangement held, and American Express grew fast across New York and into the Midwest. But there was a disagreement coming, a simple one, about how far west the company should reach. And it would split these men into two companies and send one name into history and the other into the ground. One small thing before the split: a subscribe from you is the quiet difference between work like this getting made and not. And it is the only thing these stories ask of anyone. Chapter 3. Two Names. The thing that split them was gold and the distance to it. In 1848 and 1849, gold was found in California, and the whole center of American economic gravity lurched 3,000 miles west. Overnight, there was enormous demand to move gold east and to move money, supplies, and letters west, across a continent with no railroad yet spanning it. For an express company, this was the opportunity of the century, a river of freight and specie running between the coasts. Henry Wells and William Fargo wanted to chase it. Others on the American Express board, John Butterfield among them, did not. California was far, lawless, and unproven. The overland routes were not yet built. The sea route ran for weeks around South America or across the fever coast of Panama. And the directors of a 2-year-old company in Buffalo were not eager to stake everything on a gold field on the far side of a continent they could barely reach. It was a reasonable caution. It was also, in hindsight, the single most consequential no in the company's history. So Wells and Fargo went around their own company. On the 18th of March, 1852. 2 years to the day after the founding of American Express, they organized a separate firm to serve the West. They capitalized it at $300,000, twice the original stake of American Express itself, and this time they put their own names on the door. They called it Wells, Fargo and Company. Its first president was Edwin Barber Morgan, a financier and future congressman from Aurora, New York, who also sat on the American Express board, so that the two companies were, at the top, the same small circle of men. The purpose of the new firm was to do in California and the West what American Express did in the East, and more. It would move gold and money across the continent, and it would bank, taking deposits and buying gold dust and selling drafts for a population that had rushed thousands of miles ahead of every ordinary institution meant to serve it. In a territory with almost no banks and almost no law, the Express Company became the bank, the post office, and the guarantee of last resort all at once. Now hold the two names side by side, because this is one of the quiet ironies at the center of the whole story. The company these men founded first, the one of Fargo would run for decades, the one that grew into a giant, carries no personal name at all. American Express, a country and a verb. But the company they set up almost as an afterthought to handle a gold field the main board was afraid of, carries both their names to this day, on a bank with roughly 200,000 employees, a bank most of the world could name. Wells Fargo. The sideline kept the family name. The main event erased it. And the man who did the erasing, in a sense, was Fargo himself, because he was there for both decisions. The founding that left his name off the first company, and the founding that put it on the second. He built 2 monuments. Only one of them still says his name out loud, and it happens to be the one he treated as a sideline, not the one he gave his life to. I have spent time trying to work out whether the founders understood what they were choosing, and I do not think they did, not fully. They were solving a business problem in 1852, not composing an epitaph. But the shape of the thing was set that day. One name went west and lived. One name stayed east and, in time, disappeared into the very success it created. Butterfield, the third founder, went his own way not long after, west with the mail. In 1857, he won the federal contract for the great overland mail route to California and built the stagecoach line that carried his name across the maps of the Southwest, the Butterfield Overland Mail. His name survives, too, in the history of the frontier, on trails and in towns. Of the 3 men who signed the papers in Buffalo in 1850, 2 would have their names carried into the next century by companies and routes they built. Only Fargo, the man most bound to American Express, would watch his name vanish from the thing he built most. To see how a name could vanish inside a company that large, you have to understand what the company actually did, because it was not what the word express suggests. It was not really in the business of parcels. It was in the business of trust, in a country that had almost none of the machinery we now take for granted. Chapter 4. Money by Messenger. To understand American Express in the 1850s, you have to unlearn almost everything the modern world put in place to make money boring. There was no Federal Reserve. There would not be one until 1913, 63 years after the company was founded. There was no single national currency you could count on. Instead, there were thousands of different banknotes, issued by thousands of separate banks, each worth full value near the bank that printed it, and less the farther you carried it, if it was worth anything at all. By some counts, there were thousands of distinct kinds of banknote circulating in the country at once, alongside forgeries and the notes of banks that had already failed, so that merchants kept thick printed guides just to tell good paper from worthless. There was no reliable federal parcel post for valuables. If you had gold, or cash, or bonds, or a contract that had to reach a city 400 miles away, you could not simply wire it or mail it and trust that it would arrive. What you did instead was hand it to an express company. You gave it to a messenger, a real man with a locked pouch or a strong box, who rode the trains and the stagecoaches and the steamboats with your fortune physically on his person, and who was backed by the promise of the company behind him that if it did not arrive, they were good for it. The whole system rested on that promise. The messenger was only as trustworthy as the name on the office door, and the name on the office door was only worth anything if it had never, not once, failed to make good. This is why the express companies armed their men, insured their shipments, and guarded their reputations like the assets they were. A single robbery paid out honestly built the name. A single loss quietly denied would have destroyed it. The whole enterprise ran on a promise that had to be kept in public, every time, for decades, without exception. This is the part people miss about the early express business, and it is the part that explains everything the company later became. American Express looked like a freight company. It moved boxes. But what it was really selling from the first day was trust in transit. It was selling the confidence that a valuable thing handed over in one city would become the same valuable thing in another, with a solvent company standing behind the guarantee. In a country with no central bank and no stable money, that guarantee was worth more than the freight rates. It was, quietly, a financial product wearing a freight company's clothes. The company had built, without quite announcing it, a private network of trust that reached into every town its messengers touched. And a network like that can carry more than gold. It can carry paper that stands in for gold, which is exactly what the company would learn to sell. I find this the hinge of the entire story, so I want to slow down on it. Every strange thing the company would later do, the money orders, the traveler's checks, the letters of credit, the global banking, was not a departure from the express business. It was the express business finally admitting what it had always been. The men were never really carrying parcels. They were carrying other people's faith that money moved would be money received, and they had built the most trusted name in the country for doing it. That trust made fortunes. It made William Fargo rich enough to build a block-long palace with an elevator in it. It made Henry Wells rich enough to found a college for women on a lake in Aurora and then to retire into it. By the standards of self-made American wealth in that century, these were men who had gone about as far as the country allowed a man to go. And it set up the deepest irony in the whole account. The company's greatest asset was a name that stood for permanence and trust, a name built to outlast any single man. It succeeded so completely that it outlasted the family that made it, kept none of their names, and forgot the faces behind the promise, while the promise itself went on being honored, generation after generation, at 100,000 counters. Hit subscribe if you want the next one of these. It costs nothing, and it means the story finds you when it is ready. Chapter 5. The Palace on the West Side. By the middle 1860s, William George Fargo was no longer a striving express agent. He was one of the most prominent men in Buffalo, and he was about to build the house to prove it. Consider what he had become. He was a founder, and by then the vice president, and soon the president, of the largest express company in the country. He had helped found the Western firm that carried his name across a continent. And in 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, the city of Buffalo elected him mayor, a Democrat running a northern industrial city while the country tore itself apart, and he served through 1866. A farmer's son, who had left school at 13, was now a railroad-era magnate, a company president, and the mayor of a great lake city. In 1868, two things happened that would define the rest of the family story. The company reorganized. American Express had been bled by a costly price war with a rival called the Merchants Union Express Company. So costly that in 1867 the company failed, for the first and only time in its history, to pay a dividend. The war was ruinous for both sides, a race to cut rates until neither could profit. And rather than keep destroying each other, the two firms merged late in 1868 into a new concern, the American Merchants Union Express Company, its stock certificates signed by William Fargo as president. A few years later, the older name was restored, and it was simply American Express again. Out of that whole bruising episode, William Fargo emerged at the very top, president of the combined company and the most important expressman in the country. Henry Wells, the founder, retired that same year and went home to Aurora, New York, to build his college for women and to disappear, gently, from the business he had started. And in that same year, 1868, Fargo began to build. The house on the west side was not just a rich man's home. It was a statement about permanence, made in stone by a man whose entire fortune had come from the promise that things entrusted to him would endure. He put 5 stories and a tower on it. He put in the elevator and the wood from every state and the gold fittings. He built it to stand for centuries, the way the company was built to last, and he filled it with the evidence of how far he had come. There is something almost defiant in the scale of it, a man insisting in stone and gold that the distance he had traveled, from a mail-carrying boy to the master of a national company, was real and would not be forgotten. By the standards of the age, it was among the grandest private houses in America. He had every reason to believe it would stand for a very long time. I have thought a good deal about what it means to build like that. A man who grew up carrying the mail on foot, who had known exactly how little a childhood like his was supposed to yield, put everything he had into a house designed to announce that the climb was over and the height was permanent. By the standards of his own beginnings, it was an almost impossible achievement. A palace raised by a boy who had left school to work. He had beaten the odds so completely that he built a monument to the victory. He would live in it for less than a decade. William George Fargo died on the 3rd of August, 1881, in the house he had built. He was 63. He left an estate reported at over $2 million, a great fortune for the time, though one account puts the figure far higher. And he left the presidency of American Express to his younger brother, a man who had spent his whole life inside the same company and who would run it longer than anyone before or since. There is a hard irony folded into the timing. The house was finished in 1872, and the man who raised it to stand for centuries would have only 9 more years to live in it. He was building for a future he assumed would go on, a family line that would fill the rooms for generations. The house would stand, and then stand empty, and then come down. But the company passed cleanly to the brother, and it is the brother, more than William, who holds the real secret of how this family disappeared. Because James Congdell Fargo would run American Express for more than 30 years, would preside over the products that made it immortal, and would still, at the end of all of it, leave nothing of his family behind inside the company he gave his life to. Chapter 6. The Brother. James Congdell Fargo was the younger brother, and he ran American Express for more than 30 years, one of the longest tenures in the company's history. He had been born in 1829, and he had spent his whole working life inside the company, He came up through it the way his brother had come up through the express trade, from the bottom, learning the routes and the offices and the money. And by the time William died in 1881, James was the obvious successor. He took the presidency that year and held it until 1914. For 3 decades and more, the company was his. Through the Gilded Age and the great expansion of the railroads, through financial panics and booms, through the whole transformation of the United States from a scattered post-war country into an industrial power. Presidents came and went in Washington across those long decades. At American Express, there was only James Fargo. Within the company, he ran it like a man who owned it, which, in a sense, he did. He was conservative, autocratic, and slow to change. And he distrusted anything that smelled of speculation. Under a more reckless man, the company might have chased banking or railroads and blown itself up. Under James Fargo, it did the opposite. It stayed close to what it knew, moved valuables, guarded its name, paid its dividends, and grew steadily into the largest express company in the world. He was not a visionary, he was a keeper. And the thing he kept for a very long time. There is a story often told about him that captures the man. He is said to have resisted the telephone in the company's offices long after rivals had embraced it, distrusting the device as an intrusion, a thing that let outsiders reach in without warning. Whether or not every version of that story is exact, it points at something true. James Fargo was a man of the counting house and the ledger, suspicious of novelty, comfortable with a business he could see and touch. Under his long, cautious hand, the company avoided the disasters that ambition invites. And it also very nearly missed the 2 inventions that would save its life. But the inventions that would outlive the express business, the ones that turned a freight company into a global financial network, did not come from James Fargo. They came from a man almost no one remembers, who had walked into the company as a boy. His name was Marcellus Fleming Berry, and he was hired in 1866 as a clerk, one of the countless young men who passed through the express offices carrying other people's valuables for a wage. But Berry had a gift for the mechanics of money, for the quiet engineering of how a piece of paper could be made to stand in for gold and be trusted across 1,000 miles. He rose inside the company not as an executive, but as a kind of in-house inventor, the man they turned to when a problem needed a new instrument. The first of those instruments arrived in 1882. The postal money order of the day was clumsy and disliked. An American Express, with its network of offices already reaching into towns the banks had not, was perfectly placed to do better. Berry designed the American Express money order, a simple, reliable piece of paper that let an ordinary person send money safely from one town to another through the express office. It sold immediately and in enormous numbers. In its first full year, the company is reported to have sold hundreds of thousands of them, and within a few years, the figure ran into the millions. The money order became a quiet river of income that had nothing to do with carrying boxes, a financial product sold through a freight company's counters to people who had never trusted a bank. For a firm still officially in the business of hauling valuables, it was a strange and enormously profitable thing to be doing, and it was only the beginning of what Berry would build. I want to sit with the strangeness of this pairing for a moment, because it is one of the quiet injustices of the whole account. The man whose name was on the company, James Fargo, was a careful custodian who invented nothing and is barely remembered. The man who actually invented the products that made the company immortal, Marcellus Berry, is a footnote so faint that most histories of American Express give him a sentence, if that. The family name would vanish from the company. The inventor's name never really entered it. 2 kinds of erasure running side by side, inside the same growing giant. And Barry was not finished. His masterpiece was still to come, and it would be born out of an ocean voyage and a very rich man's humiliation. Subscribing is how work like this keeps finding its way to you. It costs nothing, and it takes about a second. Chapter 7. The Check. The story goes that in 1890, James Congdell Fargo went to Europe and could not get his money. He was, by then, one of the richest and most important businessmen in the United States, the president of American Express, a man whose company's name was a byword for financial trust across a continent. He carried with him the standard instrument of the wealthy traveler, a letter of credit, a document from his bank that was supposed to let him draw cash at banks abroad. And when he tried to use it, outside the largest capitals, he found it nearly worthless. The provincial banks did not know him, did not trust the paper, and made him wait or turned him away. A man who ran the most trusted financial network in America could not, in a small European city, turn his own credit into cash. The letter of credit was the best instrument the age offered the traveling rich, and it failed precisely when and where a traveler most needed it, far from the great capitals, among strangers who had no way to know whether the paper in his hand was worth anything at all. The whole apparatus of trust that Fargo had spent his life building simply did not reach the counter of a provincial bank. So he came home angry, and he went to Barry, and by some accounts his instruction was blunt and simple. Find a way to fix this. Make something a traveler can carry that any office will honor on site. What Barry designed, and what the company issued for the first time in 1891, was the American Express Traveler's Check. The mechanism was elegant. The traveler bought the checks before leaving and signed each one once, at the top, in front of the issuing clerk. Then, when cashing it far from home, the traveler signed it again, at the bottom, and the two signatures were compared on the spot. A matching pair meant the paper was good. It was security a stranger could verify in a moment, anywhere in the world, without a telegram or a letter or a wait. It solved the exact problem that had humiliated James Fargo in Europe, and it solved it for everyone, not just the very rich. A school teacher could buy a book of checks and cross an ocean with them, safe in the knowledge that a lost or stolen check, unsigned at the bottom, was worthless to a thief and replaceable to her. The product spread across the world with astonishing speed. Within a few decades, the American Express Traveler's Check was accepted in tens of thousands of places on nearly every continent, and for the better part of a century, until the credit card and the cash machine finally overtook it, it was simply how the world carried money abroad. It also did something the company may not have fully grasped at first. And this is the part I find genuinely remarkable. When you buy a traveler's check, you hand over your money today. But you may not cash it for weeks, or months, or ever. In the meantime, the company holds your money and owes you nothing for the privilege. It can invest that money and keep what it earns. Multiply that by millions of travelers over decades, and you have an enormous, permanent, interest-free loan from the public to the company, simply for the service of holding their money safely. In the language of finance, this is called the float, and it is one of the most quietly profitable ideas in the history of money. This was the thing that would not die. The express business, the messengers and the strong boxes, and the armed men on the trains would be taken from the company inside a generation. But the paper Barry designed, the money order and the traveler's check, turned American Express into something that no longer needed the trains at all. By the standards of the business it was born into, a company that moved freight, it had quietly become something else entirely. A financial house that moved trust on paper and collected the float. The founders had sold the promise that money handed over would be money received, Barry had simply turned that promise into a product you could fold into a coat pocket and carry across an ocean. It was the same business the messengers had always been in, the business of trust, but stripped of the strong boxes and the trains and reduced to its pure essence, a signature and a piece of paper, and the name of a company solid enough to stand behind it anywhere on Earth. A boy hired to run errands in 1866 had found the thing inside the express business that would outlive the express business. And he had done it so quietly that the company itself may not have understood, at first, that its future had just walked in the door. And while Barry was making the company immortal, 300 miles away in Buffalo, the house that the family had built to prove its own permanence was standing dark and empty, waiting for the wreckers. Chapter 8. The Vacant Years. Go back to the west side of Buffalo, to the block with the tower, in the 1890s. The house is still standing, but no one is living in it. Its windows are dark and its rooms are shrouded. William Fargo has been dead since 1881. His widow, Anna, stayed on in the mansion until her own death in 1890, and after that the great house simply stopped being a home. It was too large, too costly to keep, and there was no one in the family who needed it or wanted it. So it sat, block long and shuttered, its elevator still, its rooms full of furniture and silence, through the whole of the 1890s. And then, around 1900, or the year after, the wreckers came and pulled it down, and the land was cut into ordinary lots. It is tempting to tell this as a story of extravagance, a rich man's folly too grand to survive him. But that is not quite what the record shows. The house did not fall because it was foolish. It fell because there was almost no one left to keep it, and the reason for that is the quiet tragedy that sits underneath the whole family story. Consider the arithmetic of the Fargo line. William and Anna had 8 children. 5 of them died in childhood, a horror common enough by the standards of the 19th century, but a horror all the same. 5 small coffins carried out of a family that would one day build the grandest house in the state. A man can be one of the richest in America and still bury 5 of his 8 children, and William Fargo did. The wealth that raised the tower and imported the wood from every state could buy almost anything the age offered. It could not buy a childhood that most of his children would survive. Of the children who lived, only 2 outlived their parents, and both of them were daughters, Georgia and Helen. There was no surviving son. No one carried the Fargo name out of that house and forward into the next generation as a Fargo. The founder's own line, the name itself, ended with him, so that by the time the mansion fell empty in the 1890s, there was no man named Fargo waiting to claim it, and no reason for the 2 daughters, long since settled elsewhere under married names, to come back and keep it. What remained were the 2 daughters. Georgia and Helen Fargo grew up, and by the custom of the age, they married and took other names, and moved into other families and other cities, and any Fargo blood they carried forward went on under someone else's surname. This was the ordinary machinery of the time, and it fell hard on a family with no surviving son. The name stayed behind them like a house they had grown out of, and there was no one left to whom the great house on the west side truly belonged. There was no Fargo son to inherit the great house on the west side, no Fargo heir bearing the name to grow into it, no one to fill its many rooms, or run its elevator, or keep its furnace lit through a Buffalo winter. A house is a promise about the future, a bet that there will be a family large enough and rooted enough to go on living in it. The Fargo house lost that bet within a single generation, not to scandal or ruin, but to the oldest arithmetic there is. The people who might have kept it were scattered under other surnames across the country, and a mansion that size cannot be kept by memory. It has to be kept by someone who lives in it. There was no one. I have come back to this more than once, because it reframes the demolition entirely. The house did not come down because the money ran out. The money did not run out. It came down because the family had, in the plainest biological sense, already come down. The line thinned and dispersed, and the monument to its permanence became an empty building that no one had a reason to save. The wreckers were not the cause of the disappearance. They were only the visible sign of a disappearance that had happened quietly, in a nursery and a graveyard, decades before. By the time the tower came down, the man who built it had been gone 20 years, and the name he had hoped to plant in that house for generations had already migrated onto the marriage certificates of other families. The building was the last physical thing still holding the shape of the Fargos on the west side, and when it fell, that shape fell with it. The company, meanwhile, felt none of this. It had never depended on Fargo sons. It went on selling money orders and traveler's checks, opening offices, paying dividends, entirely indifferent to whether the family that founded it still existed. And within a few years, 2 dates would arrive, close together, that would sever the family from the company completely, and then take from the company the very business it had been born to do. If you have come this far, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribing keeps them coming, and it asks nothing of you but a tap. Chapter 9. 1918. 2 dates end the story that the founders began, and they fall 4 years apart. The first is 1914. In that year, James Congdell Fargo left the presidency of American Express after more than 30 years in the chair. The manner of his leaving is described more than one way in the record. Some accounts call it a retirement, a very old man finally stepping down. Others describe it as something closer to an ouster, the end of a long struggle with his intended successor, a company man named George Chadbourne Taylor, over the direction and control of the firm. Whichever it was, the effect was the same. The last Fargo to run American Express walked out of it in 1914, after a lifetime given entirely to the company, and he died the next year, in 1915, an old man who had outlived the express age he was born into. From that point forward, there was no Fargo at the head of the company, and there never would be again. That connection did not fade slowly, it ended. And it ended just in time to miss the strangest turn in the company's history. On the 1st of July, 1918, the federal government, at war and desperate to make the railroads and the express lines run efficiently for the war effort, took the express business of the country and merged it by force. The major express companies, American Express among them, were folded into a single, government-directed entity called the American Railway Express Company. American Express contributed the largest single share of the new combine, more than any other firm, along with its routes and its rights across tens of thousands of miles of railroad. In return, it received stock in the new company, a minority share of a government-run combine. It was not alone in the loss. The other great express names of the century, Adams, and the express arm of Wells Fargo itself, were folded into the same entity, so that an entire American industry, the private carrying of valuables that had built these fortunes, was nationalized in a single wartime stroke. What American Express did not receive, then or ever, was its express business back. When the war ended, the railroads were eventually handed back to their owners, unwound from federal control. The express business was not. It stayed consolidated under the new arrangement, and the combine went on without ever dissolving back into its parts. In 1929, The whole express operation passed to the railroads themselves under a new name, the Railway Express Agency, and it ran on for decades more, but never again as American Express, and never again under a Fargo or anyone who answered to the company the founders built. The express trade that three men had merged three firms to dominate in 1850 had been, within 70 years, taken out of their heirs' hands entirely, first by a government at war and then by the railroads it had once ridden. It stayed consolidated, passed through later reorganizations, and American Express, the company founded in 1850 specifically and entirely to move valuables by express, was permanently out of the express business. The thing it was named for, the thing it was born to do, the thing William Fargo and Henry Wells and John Butterfield had merged three firms to build, was simply gone, taken by the government in wartime and never given back. It is hard to think of a stranger fate for a company. Most firms that lose their founding business die with it. American Express did not die because, by 1918, it barely needed the express business anymore. Marcellus Berry's paper had seen to that. The money orders and the travelers' checks and the float had quietly become the real company, so that when the trains and the strong boxes were taken away, what remained was a financial institution that had been hiding inside a freight company for decades, and now simply stepped out of the wreckage and kept going. Freed of the express business, the company leaned fully into what Berry had built. It expanded its travelers' checks, its foreign exchange, its money orders, and its network of offices abroad. And over the following decades, it grew into the travel and financial giant the modern world would recognize, the company of the green card and the office on the corner in 100 foreign cities. The freight company was dead. The money company it had been hiding was only getting started. There is one more oddity worth naming here because it captures how lightly this company wore its own structure. For its entire early life, through all of this, American Express was not even a corporation. It had been organized in 1850 as a joint stock association, that older, looser form, and it stayed one, remarkably, for 115 years. It did not formally incorporate until 1965. A company that would become one of the largest financial institutions on Earth spent the first century and more of its existence in a legal form better suited to a partnership of trusting men in a Buffalo office. The founders had built it that way in 1850 because that was how such ventures were built then, on personal liability and mutual trust, and the company simply never found a pressing reason to change until the modern financial world made the old form untenable. When it finally incorporated in 1965, more than a decade past its 100th birthday, it was completing a piece of paperwork that the men who founded it would not have recognized as necessary, for a company they would no longer have recognized at all. It had outlived its founders, its founding business, and very nearly its own original legal shape, and it had done all of it without slowing down. What was left, after the family and the express business were both gone, was a name, a set of products, and a machine that no longer remembered whose it had been. Chapter 10. The Name That Stayed. Look at the name today because the name is almost all that is left, and it never belonged to the family at all. American Express is one of the largest financial companies in the world. It is a component of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the short list of firms taken to stand for American business itself. In its most recent full year, it reported revenue of roughly $72 billion and profit of more than $10 billion. Its cards are carried in hundreds of millions of wallets in nearly every country on Earth, and its name sits on office towers and sponsors and screens all over the world. It employs tens of thousands of people who have very likely never heard the name Fargo spoken in connection with the company at all. It is, by almost any measure, one of the great enduring successes in the history of American money. 176 years old, and larger now than at any point in its long life. And there is not a Fargo anywhere in it. There is no Fargo on the board, no Fargo in the name, no Fargo Foundation attached to it, no descendant of William or James in any seat of the company. The name American Express, the name the founders chose in 1850 precisely because it carried the country and not themselves, did exactly what it was built to do. It outlasted them, and in outlasting them, it forgot them. The family name did survive, but on the other company, the one they treated as an afterthought. Wells Fargo is today one of the largest banks in the United States. Its name on buildings in every state, its stagecoach logo an American icon. The two names the founders left off their main company live on, in enormous letters, on a bank that the family does not own either. And the largest single owner of American Express itself, the biggest shareholder of the whole enterprise, is not a descendant of anyone who built it. It is Berkshire Hathaway, the holding company that Warren Buffett built in Omaha, Nebraska, which owns roughly a fifth of the company. A man in Omaha holds more of American Express than anyone descended from the men who founded it, and he had nothing to do with founding it at all. Let me stop the chronology here, because we have reached the present, and the present is where the shape of the whole thing finally shows itself. It would be easy to tell this as a tragedy, a proud family cursed and erased, a bloodline punished for the sin of building too grand a house. That is not what this is. This is not the story of a family destroyed by the thing it created. It is the story of a company that never needed the family in the first place, and proved it in the plainest way there is, by outliving them without a limp. What strikes me, coming back to it, is how little cruelty there was in any of it. No one erased the Fargos on purpose. The name on the company was generic from the first day, chosen by the founders themselves. The son died young, and the daughters married, and the lines simply ran out, the way lines do. The government took the express business in a war. The company adapted, because a man named Barry had built it something to adapt into. There is no villain here, and no curse. There is only the ordinary, relentless physics of an institution outliving the people who made it, which is not a tragedy so much as the thing institutions are for. What survived was the machine, the name, the products, the float, the trust, the $72 billion a year, all of it survived and grew. What did not survive was the family, the sons, the house, the name inside the company, the memory of whose hands had built it. None of that survived. The men made something designed to outlast them, and it repaid them by outlasting them completely. Go back one last time to the west side of Buffalo, to the block where the tower stood. The house is long gone. The wreckers finished their work more than a century ago, and the wood from every state and the elevator and the gold fittings are dust or scattered. Ordinary houses stand there now, on ordinary lots, and a street runs through the middle of where the ballrooms were. The street is called Fargo Avenue. It is, as far as I have been able to find, the single largest thing anywhere in the world that still carries the family's name in a place the family built. The company is 176 years old and worth more than ever, and it issues money to the world every hour of every day. The family that built it is a demolished house, a scattered handful of descendants under other names, and a street sign in Buffalo that runs past the empty ground where the grandest home in the state once stood. This is the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.